Everyone, my name is Stephanie Boozer, and I'm with CUGC HQ, and I am happy to welcome you to today's CUGC user share with Thorsten Rood. He has given a mini version of this presentation, a little teaser, if you will, at our user share XL security event back in October, and the interest was really high, and I'm glad he's back to give us the full-length version. So we'd love to have you type your questions as he goes. You can type them into the question panel over to the right, and we'll keep an eye on those, and we will probably save all those up for the end of the presentation and then ask them at that time. So, so go ahead and type them in. Don't be shy. And with that, I will turn you over to Thorsten to get us started.
Okay, thanks much, Stephanie. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good evening, whatever that is with you. For me, it's actually evening time. Don't know what that is. And in terms of recording, could be any time, literally. I'm the late Santa Claus, so to say. I learned my teaser mode from the XL webinar doing this session that I'm planning to host with you today. Was done in 20 minutes, actually, and that didn't work really very well. And so I'm happy to get a larger slot today to show you that in more detail. So welcome everybody back eventually if you've been part of the first attempt to deliver that. And the topic for today is split into two parts. I want to talk in general about making authentication more secure, better, and easier, and doing that specifically for on-premises NetScalers. So everybody's starting cloud, obviously. I think on-premises shouldn't be left behind. There's a lot of interest having a lot of infrastructure there at rest. On-premises wise, and having those instances brings up questions if security should have a different face in these days. And my attempt is to deliver two flavors of that. And the first one deals with actually integrating the Azure MFA capabilities into what on-premises can leverage. And as another aspect and perspective, how to integrate Google ReCaptcha technology for other scenarios where MFA is just simply not applicable. So that's the idea for today's session. So let's kick that off. A few remarks, as Stephanie has said, you're on mute mode as always. The chat is not actually there, but there's a question interaction portion in GoToWebinar. So paste something in there. I'm trying to collect those things either in between those two topics or at the end. And if we get exploded with questions, I'll take them offline and post them back on the website later on. Just in case you haven't yet, I would recommend you registering as a member here. You obviously have received the invite from here, so I would suspect that you know this here. So thanks for being our hosts of this webinar. And this is the agenda, actually just two things, but the difference is now it's on 45. So bear with me, it's not exactly 45, but I would say now we have more than 20 minutes per each single item, and not 20 minutes overall. So this is my menu, and I want to start with the Azure MFA integration into NetScaler Unified Gateways. So let's start with that. First of all, just to get the expectations right, what I want to essentially talk about is not just only talking about multi-factor authentication. That's just a standard thing. I want to talk about the idea of bringing touch-based authentication into the security world. Because that comes with other Azure MFA automatically. And just as a thing, you may remember things like key fobs that typically are used in the industry very widely, where you just have to type numbers from a fob that comes with you with your keys. And obviously, it is a great security perspective. Those multi-factor thing means you have something that you have and something to possess, something you need to know. But in the end, if you ask your users and eventually yourselves, it is more like the most hated protection practice because it's just secure, but it leaves behind a lot of usability aspects. Even if you have those technologies from major vendors that also now have apps for that for your smartphones, in the end, you mostly end up in something, typing something on the screen. So you have these interactivity that makes it feel a little ugly, and it's always an endless debate in security versus usability. So there's nothing wrong with those two-factor authentication methods using key fobs, but let's think about the alternative method of doing things differently. So the only important message is they are just not smart, even if it's an app, if it's just a non-smart version. And that's the thing we would like to talk about, Azure MFA. Azure MFA is something that comes directly as part of the subscription, depending on the licensing level. And what I've seen in the custom industry so far, a lot of customers now have these sort of licenses there because of their moves into the Office 365 world. So they're doing things with the entitlement, but they leave out the enhanced capabilities that comes with MFA, because a lot of people simply just don't know that this MFA has two perspectives. The first one comes fully integrated with Azure AD, where Microsoft takes care about everything, which in many scenarios requires you to think about federation, moving apps into the cloud world. But in the end, it has an on-premises version. So the idea is to say you have something that Microsoft drives forward for you that has at least an SMS-based messaging channel to allow users to receive something on a cell phone. At that point, it comes pretty close to a traditional key fob method. But for onboarding purposes, it is the needed component to just get your people going with that. And then you have the app, which you can onboard in the same way. And the app, of course, supports biometric authentication on your smartphones. So in the end, if you have rolled out the technology, we talk about touch-based authentication, which is something that users can easily accept, because that's just very straightforward to use. And from the flavors, as I was saying, the traditional way is to say we have something that is ADFS plugin based, which is challenging if you have on-premises technology and the incoming claims just arrive with no passwords. That also means that you have to deploy threaded authentication into your XenDesktop world, which is available, but obviously a little bit more complex than the standard mechanisms. There's also a plugin for the Radius infrastructure deployed on Microsoft servers. So this is the NPS and the NPS extension. But what I think, what's the interesting portion with that, Azure MFA as the on-premise version has a standalone offering, a standalone installer, which has an engine, a self-service portal capability, and an app registration capability, which allows you essentially running MFA in-house, and by this way, offers you an easy way to integrate that into your infrastructure. So if you have that, you have this Windows installer, which you get from Azure AD, so you have to subscribe to the cloud, obviously. And you can do that even in an HA manner. So there's everything there to really deploy that at enterprise scale. It has the traditional thing about administrative UI and user config things. And the most important thing that comes with that, this on-premises engine talks Radius. And by that, you have the easiest answer why that perfectly fits into existing infrastructure, because all the other third-party offerings about multi-factor and two-factor authentication, in the majority of use cases, all this relies back to a Radius dialect. And so that's the thing, how you have the access from your NetScalers to that functionality. So no specific firmware is required to actually support that. It just comes as a mainstream authentication engine. The user portal, which is meant as a self-service, comes with the product as an installable web application, which you can publish through NetScaler, obviously. And there's also a web service that is needed for the app to onboard your smartphones into your directory, so that you have an association between the users and the apps. The only thing that obviously is left into the Azure infrastructure is the messaging itself. So you don't have to worry about buying any communication components to get the notifications and the messaging out to your smartphones. That just leverages the existing internet connectivity into your Azure account. And from the NetScaler perspective, pretty easy. It is similar to what you have with today's SMS-based two-factor offerings, so just Radius. And what essentially happens there, you have a user and password, so a Windows credential triggering the MFA. So when you submit your username and password, that triggers the MFA portion through Radius, and then collects the additional confirmation by your users. What you, of course, have to take care of on the NetScaler perspective, if you plug that in as the Radius provider, you still have to create an additional LDAP authentication action as a kind of a secondary authentication, which runs through without the authentication flag being set on that policies and actions, so that you have group enumeration with that. Because with the Radius interface, you're just blindlessly, you don't have the ACL support by default. But if you plug in an additional LDAP authentication in a non-authenticating mode in behind, you can have the same stuff as you would do with any other traditional integration approach. So with that, a few screens, if you will, what you need to configure. As I was saying, the on-premises engine comes with the user portal, so a self-service interface, and also a registration interface to onboard your smartphones, because you are the hosting environment for the technology. And what you can do there, you can select any FQDN of choice, any path of choice. And in contrast to what Microsoft will recommend you, for example, deploying the user portal and the app registration on different servers because of security reasons, you can actually host those functionalities on the same system and use NetScaler as the front-end reverse proxy technology to actually differentiate between authenticated users that have access to the self-service and anonymous requests that come directly from the app for registration purposes, so you can freely host all these things on a single server or a single HA pair of machines, and then you're good to go with that. In terms of supporting different authentication scenarios, Microsoft has taken care about the idea that users could be in a partial offline scenario. So for example, if you run around through a conference where the Wi-Fi, as we all know, is very crappy, you are very happy if you get at least one device onboarded into the network just for work. If the other device, in that case, is your smartphone, and cell phone coverage and Wi-Fi is really, really bad, you run into problems for the Azure confirmation coming through to your app. And in that case, you would be locked out from your central resources because they wait for your confirmation message. The good news is, even if it's an app, the app has these so-called OATH token method also available, which is nothing more than just the traditional digits that you know from key fob style authentications. So the technology is built in a way that when Azure MFA does not get back a response from your smartphone because of communication error and the user is just screwed in that situation, it automatically switches back into a mode where the user can just type the digits that the application on the smartphone still can calculate. They are changing every 60 seconds, similar as other technologies. And if you want to provide that failback support in NetScaler, please make sure that in the Radius policies, you extend the timeout to a really, really high value. You know the default, if you configure the system, is around 5 seconds or less. In that way, or in that specific scenario, it has to be much beyond 60 seconds because you don't have an option to configure Azure to respond in that alternate method earlier than a minute. So if you instruct users that scenarios you have to wait a little longer, everything is good with that. So make sure that this value is set to a really high thing. If you think about onboarding users and then integrating that technology into your environment, obviously you need to think about coexistence. There may be other technologies in place today because you still have something in place, kind of a legacy thing that you want to get rid of because you now have a license that can do the same stuff. You don't have to pay for a third party anymore, but for a certain period of time, you may have multiple authentication providers side by side in your environment because migration may take a while. And at that point, you need to think about how the UI looks like. Traditionally, a lot of two-factor authentication technologies have these 3 input field form style because they collect the type digits as additional factor. If you think about the Azure MFA, which works a little bit different with that. They just need username and password, and then they trigger something that goes out to your smartphone. You need to adjust your authentication policies on NetScaler to actually deal with a blank password field. Because in the Azure scenario, you just type two things, username and password, and the rest comes through touch. Whereas the traditional existing solution maybe is username, password, and a token code. The key behind all that to supporting these mixed mode deployments is nfactor. Because with nfactor, you have the ability on NetScaler to dynamically decide what the user actually should respond with. So you can accept situations where the user fills in less on the screen that is actually displayed, especially when it comes to the native receivers, which are a little bit hard in these days to support with nfactor. You must provide something for the third field in these scenarios. But with nfactor, you can easily design something where you would accept kind of a static text like MFA that you just types in there, because the native receiver doesn't allow you submitting a partially empty form. But in the end, we tested that in a variety of scenarios. You can do these coexisting scenarios relatively easy. So that will work. What's also an interesting point when we think about users that use just a single device when they are on the road. In that case, using those XenDesktop solutions where you have a big screen attached to your smartphone. In that case, your MFA eventually sits on the same endpoint as the native receiver also does. So we call these the single device access solution. This technically works very well, so you can do that. But obviously, the users then have to flip between the receiver app and the MFA app. So it is a little bit tricky in terms of actually navigating. But technically, that is doable. I personally remark on that. I would recommend that in those scenarios, users really differentiate their computing device with their MFA-enabled device. So the majority of users actually uses at least two devices, the one as kind of a PC or whatever, tablet on the road solution, and the smartphone as a plus device with that, so that shouldn't be a huge problem. In terms of publishing, as I was saying, you can do all these endpoints on the same box. You can do the authenticator SOAP URI directly on NetScaler as an anonymous resource. And the good thing is, from the interface that Microsoft has programmed in their PhoneFactor application, it's just that one single path that you have to allow to pass through without nagging users for authentication. And the other thing specifically deals with the user self-service portal. When you think about that, you have the NetScaler front-ending any personalized content where the user self-service obviously belongs to. You want to have a better user experience by leveraging NetScaler SSO technology. So you just have to type your authentication once, and then all the other back-end applications get automatically signed in. Because of the nature how this form is programmed, the default NetScaler SSO rules will not apply. But if you are a little bit fancy and know about how rewriting works, you can rewrite the body from the PhoneFactor user portal application and just inject that little JavaScript in there that has the same effect as when NetScaler would search for the automatic submit portion. So you can get that into really a true single sign-on scenario, which I can show you later in the screen. But before showing something, I would give you a diagram how that all looks like. What you obviously have is the existing NetScaler Unified Gateway. By the way, if you have a NetScaler in a classic gateway mode, traditional standard gateway technology, this is kind of a dead-end road for integrating those type of things. Not because of the authentication, that would work pretty well, but the thing is integrating the user portal for onboarding purposes. In that scenarios, you have a NetScaler device that has to publish both HDX resources and web resources, and if you want to do that side by side in a very seamless manner, in a very usable manner where the user doesn't differentiate the resources per se and just wants to have a single log-on experience, all this is typically a unified gateway technology, which is specifically built for those reasons, just to authenticate the user once and then allowing multiple resources. So assuming the gateway is done, you would complement that existing environment with your on-premises MFA server or servers. As I was saying, you can have multiples of them for availability reasons, and obviously NetScaler will balance them as well. Those machines traditionally are domain members with your directory, and on the outside perspective, they require Azure AD for licensing the entitled users. And with that, you need to think about the components that actually sit on the systems. The most important one, obviously, is the radius authentication, which you can leverage on the NetScaler as the credential providers, which will also work with classic authentication. I was previously talking about nfactor, which is the modern way of creating NetScaler authentication scenarios, but it even will work in classic deployments. So depending on the scenario, it will work even with classic. Eventually have less flexibility in terms of coexisting with other solutions, but technically doesn't matter if it's nfactor or classic, because technology-wise, which about Radius protocol is available in both of these methods. And what you have along with the MFA server is the installed IIS. And what you have there is the application registration URI, which is needed for your smartphones to register with your environment so that everything is personalized on a specific user account, which is an anonymous proxy request. And if you know that it's just one URI, you can safely publish that to the existing content switch on NetScaler and can be very, very sure that this is an intended resource access, but the outside world has nothing more available on your systems. And the other thing is the user self-service portal. This is something that should be made available only to authenticated users, which means we extend the reverse proxy with an authentication capability. That's exactly the reason why I talk about unified gateway here. And the bookmark and the URL for the self-service portal just can be inserted in the existing unified gateway portal as a web bookmark. So the user, along with HDX icons on the screen when he logs into your portal, also has a nice link there that takes them directly to the enrollment pages for onboarding with the new solution. And that also works even if the user is in enrollment mode for the first time usage, and that's something I will show you how that all works out. When then the user is enrolled with the system and authenticates, it is a flow that works like this. You have an access request from the outside. The user gets presented with a login form where you submit all the needed credentials, and then you pass everything through Radius. And when the point is reached where it comes at your MFA server, that machine then leverages the existing Azure AD functionalities to realize the push method to wake up the device, to wake the application, so that the touch actually can be requested from the user. That's something you don't have to take care of, so the machine just has to have access to the phone factor resources that live in the Azure cloud. And that's the thing, how the stuff works. If you have then a grant from the user perspective to say, yes, that's me, let me in, so essentially doing the touch, the user is let in and then has access to the resources such as XenDesktop and others. I would say the straightforward way is to show that. So forward to a demo. Before going there, a little bit of explanation. Look at the screen background. That's important. If it is a red background, we talk about something that is an administrative experience. If it switches to a blue mode or just a browser, then it is the user experience that we talk about. So first of all, we obviously start with the admin. That's the UI sitting on a standard Windows server. We just select your user for enrollment. So I selected a blank one. You can select the languages that get sent out. You define that a PIN is automatically created for the user and automatically sent to the phone that is pre-registered in Active Directory with that user account. So the metadata on Active Directory should be valid in terms of the phone number. The user, if it has access to any mail method, either Active Supervisor or whatever, receives an automatic email from the system that you can completely personalize to your needs. So you can welcome them very specifically. And what he gets presented with is his onboarding PIN, which is important because you need to have something for authentication at that point to make sure that is the user. So when the user now accesses the portal and logs in here, you can leave out the passcode field blank because that's an nfactor multipurpose scenario. He receives an SMS because he has nothing enrolled so far. So he types the PIN from the email, types the SMS that is sent in that way, says submit, and that's the traditional onboarding. He guts back into the unified portal, which has a web link, the MFA self-service, that goes through the same NetScaler, goes through single sign-on and stuff like that. So another SMS is sent out to the device to enroll inside of MFA. And here at that point, the user obviously will change his PIN to something personal. So all that is completely self-service capable. And then the user can decide to activate the app. The app comes from public store. That's nothing special, just download as is, which comes there as the authenticator asking for a first account. Then he clicks on generate, comes QR code. Your smartphone obviously has a camera. So you say it's my enterprise account, you hold that to the screen. Here we go. This talks to your on-premises infrastructure to register, and now you have your account, which is now ready for use. So you can choose your default method back into the mobile app. And from there, you have touch enablement for strong authentication. So we're closing anything here, avoiding the browsers, closing everything, coming back to our resources, and now we come to something that is really, really handy for users. We have the username, we have the password, just say submit. We just await your smartphone to say, hey, give me a touch verification. You do the touch. Here we go. Bang. Just touch again, and that's it. You see, the screen loads forward. And this is something that is very, very secure, but on the other side, also very handy for the users. What you can do in terms of configuration, you can make sure that the user doesn't enroll more devices than you would like him to. So essentially saying I want to limit these apps, for example, to just one. You see on screen the device limit tag in here. That's something that is debatable, but many customers I work with want to exactly know the registered devices and eventually want to limit that to a known number. So that's the thing. With that, that was a very handy deploy how to use that. Let me quickly have a look on the chat scenario. There's something intermediately. An intermediate question. Let me take both of these questions for later, guys. I've read them, and we will park them. So we'll come back to that later. Because that seems needs a little more time than just a yes or no verification. And with that, think about this as the future strategy of doing multi-factor authentication that is very, very acceptable for the users. I think that's an interesting perspective to run your infrastructure with that. And by the way, as the MFA server speaks native Radius protocol, you can also think about adjusting your existing VPN solutions that come from other third-party technologies to leverage the same functionality. It's not just limited to NetScaler, as it's just standard Radius RFC protocol. But in the end, there are also other scenarios where you don't have the luxury of really knowing the users in a way that you can tag them all with a specific individual token. Think about B2B or B2C scenarios. This is something where obviously the association between the user and device, specifically with phone numbers and then dealing all these complexities, doesn't scale very well, but you still may have the need to provide better security. That's the thing why I want to talk about an alternative method for those scenarios where multi-factor just doesn't scale. And this is Google ReCaptcha. ReCaptcha, it's already on screen. It's this I'm not a robot thing, which is available on NetScaler. And the reason for thinking about CAPTCHA-based technologies, it is about rate limiting. The danger that comes with a traditional authentication that is not secured with an additional factor is that you have kind of a honeypot situation, that you have unprivileged users, both unwanted and undesired audiences that try to gain access to your systems. One common method to prevent undesired logins on those simple request forms is called rate limiting. So saying I want to just allow a certain number of authentication attempts in a certain time frame. But in the end, that doesn't scale very well because you need to find a number, right? You need to find a threshold that actually is a good rate, whereas everything else is at a bad rate. And that is very, very hard to find a good way for that. As you know, NetScaler by itself is very robust on brute force authentication methods and exploits. But you need something that helps NetScaler differentiating the good and the bad guys. So finding ways of leaving out the script kiddies, and CAPTCHA comes in for that when you have a very heterogeneous user audience where multi-factor doesn't work. So you don't have to worry about actually rate filtering the API. You just say, hey, just go on full power with login brute force mechanism, but I want to rely on something that a user can easily satisfy, but a robot or botnet or whatever is very hard to get at a rate where I'm getting into danger. So what essentially is Google ReCaptcha? Google ReCaptcha is something that injects into your web forms as an additional placeholder that has interactivity with the user. So you have to allow something in terms of JavaScripting that interacts with your user on your personal login pages. And this is something that is powered by a gigantic Google backend to give you some help in terms of machine learning and other stuff where they try to prevent storms against you because they have the better resources and capabilities to do that. So the idea is you tolerate a single factor for use for endpoints where you just can have a good insight on the users. And the same way, you don't want to deal with those rate limiting configurations because you know that you will fail with that. And the requirements for that is pretty easy. You register with Google for a new ReCaptcha. You specify the supported domain names because each ReCaptcha is individual to each registrant, so to each customer, to each company, whatever. And of course, the client that has to then undergo a different way of authentication, he has to support web technologies. This is an important hint because right now, when we talk about integrating ReCaptcha into a XenDesktop use case, this ultimately breaks the native receiver. So if you want to have that, you are limited to the web receiver only. So it's either logging in through the web browser, then clicking on an icon that then fires the locally installed native receiver. That is working. That's not the problem. The authentication sequence has been done in the web browser. Or you live with the HTML5 receiver in the same browser session, which essentially doesn't need you any client at all. But if you want to have the native receiver with native integration into the operating system, which also includes native authentication forms that are thrown by the receiver itself, that isn't working right now. We all are awaiting a receiver generation that talks nfactor, and I would say it's nothing very super secret that by 2018 it is likely to happen that we have that. But right now, if you want to have ReCaptcha with XenDesktop, it is receiver for web as the authentication UI. The runtime can be done with a native executable, but login experience is limited to a browser because of the injection of something where the receiver engine has not been built for. What you need in that case, you absolutely require nfactor technology. So this is something that doesn't work with classic authentication masks because the classic authentication masks don't know about third-party plugins. With nfactor, you have the capability of creating NetScaler login schemes that have more than just standard input fields. And ReCaptcha essentially is something that is not a standard input field. It is preloaded on the box, so some supporting JavaScript stuff is already deployed on NetScaler on the backend portion and on the client-side framework. But what obviously is not enabled by default is a login mask that has the include fields ready. So as I was saying, receive for web is the only thing that works right now. And if you have this form that now has the user responded to, it contains a value which is called ReCaptcha. This is the thing that you have to parse and forward into your infrastructure and then relay that out to Google for further verification. I've seen a lot of support articles right now that all try to deal with picking up values from post requests. I've seen a lot of interesting approaches that typically incorporate something like before string and after string, which is technically okay, but it is not really accurate. If you think about how those postings look like, this is an attribute value, and it's a multi-attribute value pairing that happens there. The official sequence to pick the value from there is using a typecast on the body to actually pick the right wording there. So the line that stands on screen here, the PE expression, just captures the value from the from the highlighted portion in red. So everything that starts with O3, AJZ, QF, and so on is a thing that now goes into the expression. Pretty straightforward. If you don't have seen the NV type list thing yet, play around with that. That's much easier to use than the standard before and after string methodology. Just play with that, just looking, just as from there. Runtime, obviously, you need firmware 11. That's just a matter of fact because the includes that come with the nfactor client-side scripting have been preloaded with CAPTCHA support, starting with 11.0. And of course, because it is nfactor, nfactor requires CGB and enterprise licensing, which, by the way, is the same thing with Unified Gateway technology that I was presenting in the first portion of the presentation. So, of course, yes, this leaves out a certain audience that is on either Gateway license or NetScaler Standard license. But if you compare the benefit of those technologies, I think the enterprise licensing is not the end of the world. SDX customers already are smiling because with SDX you have the full range of licenses available anyway. So with that, Platinum is there to go, but technically enterprise license is the minimum needed thing. From a configuration practice, I've also have seen a bunch of readmes so far. They recommend you of putting the so-called side key directly into the JavaScript file that sits on NetScaler, which is straightforward. The only downside of that approach is each time you upgrade the firmware, those back-end infrastructure files get overwritten. So they sustain a reboot, but they do not survive a main firmware upgrade. So my suggestion instead would be, as they are delivered through NetScaler to the client, they can be touched by the rewrite engine. So just search for the empty side key with a rewrite, inject the public key in there for rewrite action, and this will ultimately guarantee you that on a future firmware upgrade, everything stays as it is. Again, another diagram I think is interesting for that, how that looks like. You have a single factor authentication listener because you don't have third parties included with that. You have things that you want to publish. In that example, I use out of web app, for example. We have this XenDesktop with us, so anything that you want to authenticate to. And what you now need is the help from Google. If the user accesses your site, the nfactor mask displays a slightly different login experience, which leverages the CAPTCHA tag, which triggers the JavaScripts that are loaded from Google, and they display this inner "I'm not a robot" methodology. The "I'm not a robot" thing can be configured as you as an admin can configure the restrictions that come with those verifications. So, for example, the aggressiveness of pictures that the user has to click through, which is the nagging portion of "I'm not a robot," obviously. The good news is if you play with that for a longer time, you realize that computers that have been scanned previously and have been successfully validated, and they come back, they don't get nagged with another tile arena. They just get through with just tapping the check mark and then can continue working. So it's not that user challenging as it will look like. It is, of course, challenging on first-time usage because you have to undergo the procedure of selecting and submitting something. When all this is done, what you have is a computed ReCaptcha key that is sent to the NetScaler as part of the standard user credentials, so user password, single sign-on stuff. And along with that, the ReCaptcha comes into the NetScaler. And NetScaler picks that value and has to authenticate back to Google to verify if that response from the user actually makes sense, or if that was something captured and manipulated that doesn't match to that specific request. And at that point, you have your grant message. And afterwards, if that first factor, which is kind of the invisible first factor, was granted, you run through the second factor, which is an elder policy. And from there on, you have either XenDesktop, other web app, or whatever type of resource you want to publish there. Again, seeing is believing is pretty straightforward. We go here, we just have the user perspective ready, and it's just to demonstrate how it looks like from usability. You have your existing resource, navigate there. This loads nfactor, this loads your personal site key along with that, which is a public one. You type in your user stuff and password, and now you have to go through the I'm not a robot sequence, which is the first time used for that demo browser. So in that case, that's like street signs. Go there, tap them in the right way, say next, get another one, another street sign. We know and love that, and with that, the cookie is persistently, so next time it will be easier. And then we say log on. I didn't implement the full backend here for the showcase, just to validate what's happening. You see my welcome with the username. Instead of navigating to other web app or XenDesktop or whatever. But that's essentially everything you have to do on the NetScaler. And then it's just perfectly working. And that's, I would say, the better approach than just trying to do something with rate limiting those type of scenarios. They don't scale very well. They are debatable. This is a little bit nagging for the users, but in the end, I would say the better trade-off. As you remember, I have invited to something that was called Better Authentication Made Easy. I would say you have no excuses. You have both options available. Both are very, very handy to use and configure. And from user perspective, they are really something that match into today's user expectations. That's something modern that makes more sense than the traditional ones. And with that, I am done with my two portions of that, saying thank you until that portion. I will quickly grab back the question window if I find that here. I'm trying to capture a few of them. Here we go. So you are invited to type while I'm reading. Quickly see how much interest we have in here. So let me quickly read through that. Okay, the first question, it is about if you're using the Azure MFA server, so that deals with the first portion of our session, the Azure MFA server on-prem, has it to be required the MFA, the portable for a user? The thing is, so the question, just to summarize a little different for those that are not that much familiar with that, you of course have synchronized users in Azure AD. AD Connect and stuff like that is all set up. But the user account configuration on Azure, specifically the MFA options, are disregarded for that use case. If you run on-prem MFA, you download the MFA explicitly for your Azure AD account, get your joining site key to make sure that it's your environment connecting to your subscription and your tenant. And then you are the owner, which user has to be MFA enabled and which user is not, because the on-prem MFA service specifically was built to allow deep on-premises integration and leaving out the Azure AD footprint, especially the interactive one, as much as possible. So it is not needed that you tag any of your, let's say, Office 365 users that are already there with the MFA tag, which will be the conflict. I think that's the question where that goes to. You have a separate directory, if you will, on your MFA on-premises server that obviously links the user account from Azure AD because of licensing. So the user has to be licensed, but it doesn't have to be configured. So I think that's a pretty good coexistence in between standard O365 access methods and the more secure needs for certain on-premises resources. So play with that. I would say if you compare that to the NPS plugin stuff, you don't have that free choice because the plugin is more integrated with the Azure AD than the MFA server is. Essentially, it's much more technology. The MFA installer lives behind a larger on-premises footprint. The NPS plugin is very tight, but obviously has less options. So hopefully this is the answer to that question. Thanks for asking. Next question, how to configure the MFA integration with NetScaler. Suggestion for that, I have a demo config for that. Essentially, it's not that rocket science, it's just a radius action, but I provide you with the config beyond the material that we already have for the webinar. Give me a few, I would say, better days than hours, and I provide you with a script config that is readable. But the technically challenge is really, really low. If you know how to configure radius action on NetScaler, you know how to configure the MFA integration, but I'll provide you with that stuff. Feedback here was on the first question, so thanks for confirming that was the right answer we were looking for. Okay, another question. Let me quickly go through a scenario. Does the recapture technique won't help in a situation of stolen credentials? Yes, absolutely correct. If your users are so lazy that their password is just known to others, recapture won't prevent any other user access, because even if it's a malicious user with a stolen credential, he can obviously respond to the captcha in the right way. So recapture was not made for protecting a valid credential. Recapture was made to protect you against brute force attacks for attackers that try to guess the right credential. So if you have single factor logins where this is has been made for, you really need to think about password policies in terms of either complexity or change rate and other things. It will never ever help you if the credential has been stolen. This theft has been undetected and the credentials are duplicated around for a while. In that case, recapture will not help. But as I was saying previously, I'm not saying that recapture is the better approach than MFA. Recapture is the ultimate last help that guides you forward for those scenarios where you don't have the chance to give every single user an MFA capability. Specifically, the Azure MFA comes with a license cost, so that doesn't scale very well in B2B and B2C. It's more for the employees. If you have a wide audience with a huge amount of guest accounts and whatever, this doesn't work very well, and recapture wasn't made for that specific scenario. So no, it will not help for theft, but it will allow to leave the botnets out of your world. So hopefully that answered that question. So another thing, going through, no, that was a repeated one. I think that has been answered. So for that, in case you have more to ask, just type. We leave that pane open for a bit. I would say thank you. My Santa Claus mission for this year is done right now. I'm planning to provide you some more stuff by 2018, but this is completely undecided what that could be. You're also invited to leave suggestions, if you will. Otherwise, I come back with something at my own shows. I'm happy to invite you back to another webinar. So with that, Merry Christmas. I'm wishing you a good start into the new year 2018, which is just a few days ahead. And thanks for your time, and see you back soon. With that, I would like to hand back over to Stephanie. Thanks and bye.
Awesome. Thank you, Thorsten. That was great. And thank you all for attending today. And just as a reminder, you guys will get a link to the recording of today's webinar and also to the presentation deck so that if you need to revisit anything. I've put a link in the chat for you to a really short survey. And we'd love to get your feedback on this. It helps us plan all our future webinars. I am also putting in the chat right now a link to the forum thread on mycugc.org. If you have more questions about this presentation, you can type them in, and Thorsten will take a look at them. We've had that happen with one of your previous webinars. I think, Thorsten, they've had an ongoing conversation on it. So please, if you have more questions, feel free to visit that forum thread and type those in. And with that, I want to thank you all again and wish you all a great afternoon and evening for you, Thorsten. And hope to see you guys again on a mycugc.org webinar in 2018. Bye.